My mother-in-law didn't bring a gift to my baby shower. She brought a lawyer and a legal document to take my baby away. At first, no one understood what was happening, including me. The room was filled with soft laughter, pastel decorations, and the kind of warm, careful joy people put on when they're trying to celebrate something fragile. I remember thinking, just for a moment, that maybe this day would fix everything that had been broken between us. Because for months, things had been tense. Not explosive, not dramatic in an obvious way, but quiet, controlled, and suffocating. The kind of tension that hides behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words, where every conversation feels like a test you didn't know you were taking. Still, I wanted this to work. I needed it to. So when she stood up in the middle of the room, gracefully, confidently, like she had done this 1,000 times before, no one questioned it. Conversations faded naturally, attention shifted toward her, and she began to speak about family, about legacy, about doing what's best for the child. It sounded almost beautiful, until she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope that didn't belong in a moment like this. Something in my chest tightened, a quiet warning I couldn't explain. I watched her walk toward me, her expression calm, almost kind, as if what she was about to do was completely reasonable. "I think it's time we did what's best for the baby," she said softly. At first, I thought she meant advice, support, maybe even an apology. But when I opened the envelope, I realized the truth. It wasn't a message. It was a legal petition for custody of my child, filed before my baby was even born. And when I looked up, expecting shock, confusion, anything at all, I saw something much worse. No one was surprised. No one was surprised. That was the part one couldn't process, not right away. Not even as my hands were still holding the paper and my eyes kept rereading the same line over and over again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying if I just gave them enough time. A legal petition for custody, filed in advance, supported by documentation I didn't even know existed, written in a tone so cold and certain it felt like my future had already been decided without me. And yet, when I looked up, the room didn't explode into confusion the way it should have. There were no gasps, no immediate protests, no one stepping forward to say this had to be some kind of mistake. Instead, there were glances, quick, uneasy, carefully hidden, but not shocked. Not truly. It was subtle, but it was there. Recognition. That's when something inside me shifted, slow and heavy, like a door I didn't want to open but couldn't keep closed anymore. Because that look, that quiet understanding in the room, meant one thing I wasn't ready to accept. They knew. Maybe not everyone. Maybe not every single person standing there with a glass in their hand and a polite smile frozen halfway across their face. But enough of them. Enough to make this feel less like an outburst and more like something rehearsed, something prepared, something that had been building long before I ever walked into that room believing this was a celebration. My eyes moved instinctively, searching for the one person who was supposed to be on my side no matter what. My husband. He was standing exactly where I had last seen him, just a few feet away, close enough that he should have already been next to me, already taking the paper out of my hands, already saying something, anything, to shut this down. But he wasn't moving. He wasn't even looking at me. His gaze was fixed somewhere lower, not quite on the floor, not quite anywhere at all, like he had suddenly found something invisible that demanded all of his attention. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, and there was a stillness about him that didn't feel like shock. It felt like hesitation, and that was worse. "Say something," I heard myself say, though my voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It came out quieter than I expected, thinner, like it had to push its way through something thick just to be heard. He didn't respond immediately. That silence stretched just long enough to confirm what I was starting to fear, and when he finally looked up, there was something in his expression I had never seen before, something that didn't belong to the man I thought I married. Not anger, not confusion, guilt. "I was going to tell you," he said, and even though the words were soft, they landed harder than anything else that had happened so far. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Because those 6 words didn't just answer one question. They answered all of them. This wasn't just her. This wasn't just a controlling mother overstepping boundaries or trying to manipulate a situation to her advantage. This was something deeper, something that reached into my own marriage and twisted it into something I no longer recognized. "You knew?" I asked, And this time my voice didn't shake. If anything, it steadied, sharpened, like something inside me was beginning to lock into place. He hesitated again, and that hesitation told me everything before he even opened his mouth. "I didn't think she'd do it like this," he said. Not denial, not rejection, just adjustment. As if the problem wasn't the plan itself, but the timing of it. The execution. The way it had been revealed instead of whether it should exist at all. I let out a small, disbelieving breath, my fingers tightening around the edge of the document as I looked back down at it, forcing myself to actually see what was written there instead of just reacting to it. Claims about instability, concerns about financial independence, statements about emotional readiness, each one phrased carefully, professionally, backed by references I didn't recognize and evaluations I had never agreed to. It was detailed, too detailed, which meant this hadn't been put together in a rush. This had taken time, planning, observation, and suddenly, moments I had dismissed before began to resurface, one after another, falling into place with a clarity that made my stomach turn. The questions she used to ask me, always framed as concern. The way she insisted on being involved in certain appointments. The subtle comments about how overwhelming motherhood could be for someone like me. Even the arguments my husband and I had. The ones that somehow always circled back to whether we were ready, whether we were stable, whether we had enough. At the time, they felt like disagreements. Now, they felt like documentation. "I don't understand," I said slowly, though the truth was I was starting to understand far more than I wanted to. "You think I'm not capable of raising my own child?" That question wasn't just for him. It was for her. For everyone. But she was the one who answered. "This isn't about what you think you're capable of," my mother-in-law said, her tone calm, measured, as if we were discussing something purely practical. "It's about what's best for the child." There it was again. That phrase. So clean. So absolute. As if it erased everything else. I looked at her, really looked at her this time. And for the first time since I had met her, I stopped trying to interpret her, stopped trying to soften the edges of who she was in my mind just to make things easier. Because there was no misunderstanding left. No room for benefit of the doubt. This wasn't concern. This was control. And she believed, with complete certainty, that she was justified. A quiet laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Not because anything was funny, but because the situation had crossed into something so unreal that my mind didn't know how else to react. "You planned this," I said, more to myself than anyone else. But the moment the words left my mouth, I knew they were true. Not just the document. Not just today. All of it. And as that realization settled in, something inside me changed. The fear didn't disappear. The shock didn't vanish. But underneath it, something else began to form. Something steadier, something sharper. Because if this had been planned, then it could be fought. I slowly folded the document, placed it back into the envelope, and set it down on the table with a care that felt almost deliberate, as if I was marking the end of one moment and the beginning of another. When I looked up again, I wasn't searching for reassurance anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to fix this. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice clear now, steady in a way I hadn't felt just minutes before. My mother-in-law didn't react, not outwardly. If anything, her expression softened slightly, like she had expected resistance. Like this was just another step in a process she already understood. "You don't have to," she replied gently. "That's not how this works." A small chill ran through me, but this time, I didn't let it take hold. Because whatever she thought she had already secured, whatever she believed was inevitable, she was wrong about one thing. She thought I was unprepared. She thought I wouldn't see it coming. But now that I did, I wasn't going to lose my child without a fight. For a few seconds after I said it, no one moved. The air in the room felt different now, heavier, like the celebration had been quietly replaced by something no one wanted to name out loud. The pastel decorations, the half-opened gifts, the soft music still playing somewhere in the background. It all suddenly looked out of place, like a carefully staged illusion that had collapsed without warning. And standing in the middle of it, I realized something that made everything even clearer. This baby shower had never really been for me. It had been a setup. "I think everyone should give them a moment," someone said awkwardly from across the room, their voice uncertain, as if they were trying to restore order to something that couldn't be fixed with politeness anymore. A few guests nodded, too quickly, too eagerly, grateful for an excuse to step away from what had just unfolded. Chairs shifted, quiet murmurs filled the space, and within seconds, the room began to empty. Not completely, but enough to leave only the people who mattered. Or rather, the people who had been involved. The door clicked softly as the last of the distant relatives stepped out. And just like that, the atmosphere changed again. No more pretending. No more audience. Just us. I stayed where I was, one hand instinctively resting against my stomach, not out of fear this time, but out of something more grounding, like a reminder of what all of this was really about. Across from me, my mother-in-law adjusted her posture slightly, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve, completely composed, as if what had just happened was nothing more than a necessary conversation finally brought into the open. My husband still hadn't moved much, but now he looked between the two of us, caught in a space that he had helped create and clearly didn't know how to navigate. That might have made me feel sorry for him once. Not anymore. You really thought this was the right way to do it? I asked, my voice calm but firm, because if there was one thing I understood now, it was that losing control, even emotionally, was exactly what she expected from me. And I wasn't going to give her that. This isn't about the way, she replied smoothly. It's about the outcome. Of course it was. Everything with her always came down to results, efficiency, control. Emotions were distractions. Relationships were variables. And people were pieces that either fit into her plan or got moved out of the way. And the outcome you want, I continued, holding her gaze now, refusing to look away, is to take my child. She didn't flinch. I want to ensure that this child has stability, she said. Security. Opportunities you can't provide. The words were sharp, even though her tone wasn't. That was always her way. Never loud, never openly cruel, but precise enough to cut exactly where it mattered. Before, I would have defended myself immediately, tried to prove her wrong, listed everything I had done, everything I was capable of. But something about seeing the full picture now changed that instinct. Because this wasn't about convincing her. She had already decided who I was. This was about understanding how far she had gone. So you hired a lawyer, I said. Built a case. Collected information about me without telling me. And somehow convinced my husband to go along with it. At that, my husband shifted uncomfortably, finally stepping forward as if he couldn't stay silent any longer. It's not like that, he said quickly, his voice low, defensive in a way that felt more about protecting himself than fixing anything. You're making it sound worse than it is. I turned to him slowly. Worse than it is, I repeated, and even though I kept my tone even, something underneath it hardened. You let your mother file for custody of our child before it's even born, and you think I'm exaggerating? He ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face, but it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at me. She's trying to help, he said. You know how things have been lately. The stress, the arguments, your job situation, my job situation? I cut in, the first real edge entering my voice. Because now we were getting somewhere. Now the pieces were starting to connect in ways that made my stomach twist. Yes, he said, more firmly now, like he had found something he could stand on. You left your job 2 months ago. I didn't leave, I said. I was laid off. That's not the point. No, I replied, holding his gaze. That is exactly the point. Because suddenly, I could see it. How it had been framed. How it had been used. Not as a temporary setback, but as evidence. Is that in there? I asked, nodding toward the envelope still sitting on the table between us. My employment status? My financial records? Every moment where things weren't perfect. Neither of them answered immediately. They didn't need to. Silence had become its own kind of confirmation. A slow, cold realization settled in, deeper than before, more complete. They hadn't just been watching me. They had been building a case against me. Every vulnerable moment, every struggle, every doubt I had ever shared, especially with him, trusted him with, had been turned into something usable, something legal. That's why you kept asking me about money, I said quietly, more to myself now, but loud enough for them to hear. That's why you wanted access to our accounts. That's why you kept bringing up whether we were ready. I looked back at my husband, and for the first time, I didn't see confusion or hesitation. I saw someone who had chosen a side. You weren't worried, I said. You were documenting. His expression tightened, and for a brief moment, something like regret flickered there, but it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. It's not like that, he repeated, but the words felt empty now, like something he needed to believe more than something that was actually true. Across from us, my mother-in-law finally stepped in again, her presence steady, controlled, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. "We're not your enemies," she said calmly. "You're looking at this the wrong way." I let out a slow breath, shaking my head just slightly. "No," I said. "I think this is the first time I'm seeing it exactly the way it is." And that was the moment something shifted again, not just inside me, but in the dynamic between us. Because up until now, they had been operating under one assumption: that I didn't understand what they were doing, that I would react emotionally, defensively, maybe even irrationally, that I would be easy to manage. But that version of me was gone, replaced by something they hadn't planned for. Someone who was paying attention, someone who was connecting the dots, someone who wasn't going to play the role they had already written for her. "You said this is about what's best for the child?" I continued, my voice steady, deliberate. "Then let's talk about that." My mother-in-law tilted her head slightly, intrigued, but cautious. "Go on," she said. I took a small step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to shift the balance of the conversation. "Because if you're going to argue that I'm unfit," I said, "then I'm going to need to understand exactly what you think qualifies you." For the first time since this started, she didn't answer immediately. It wasn't a long pause, not enough for anyone else to notice anything unusual, but I noticed. Because up until now, she had moved through this entire situation with absolute control, every word measured, every response ready before the question had even fully formed. This time, she had to think. And that told me something important. I had finally stepped outside the version of me she had prepared for. "You're asking the wrong question," she said at last, her voice still calm, still composed, but just slightly more deliberate than before. "This isn't about comparing you to me." "No," I replied, holding her gaze. "Because it sounds exactly like that." She gave a small, almost patient smile, the kind people use when they believe they're explaining something simple to someone who just doesn't understand. "It's about capacity," she said. "Resources, environment, the ability to provide a life that is stable, structured, and controlled." I interrupted softly. The word landed between us, sharper than anything I had said so far. Her smile didn't disappear, but it changed, just enough for me to see what was underneath it. "You say that like it's a bad thing," she replied. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't have one, but because I was starting to realize that this conversation wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about understanding her. Because the more clearly I could see the way she thought, the easier it would be to break whatever plan she believed was already set in motion. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "You've decided that because I don't meet your definition of stability, you get to step in and take over." "Legally, I've decided," she corrected gently, "that this child deserves the best possible start in life. And I'm not part of that." She didn't hesitate this time. Not in the way that matters most. The honesty of it should have shocked me. A part of me expected her to soften it, to wrap it in something more acceptable, something that would make it easier to swallow. But she didn't. Because in her mind, she wasn't doing anything wrong. She was fixing a problem, and I was the problem. Beside me, my husband shifted again, like he wanted to say something, like he felt the weight of what had just been said, but whatever impulse he had didn't turn into action. He stayed quiet. Again. And that silence, more than anything else, solidified something inside me that I hadn't fully allowed myself to accept until now. I was on my own. Not in the sense that I had no options or no way out of this situation, but in the sense that the person who was supposed to stand next to me had already stepped back, had already made his choice. And if I was going to get through this, if I was going to protect my child, then I couldn't afford to keep expecting him to suddenly become someone he clearly wasn't. "Okay," I said quietly, nodding once, more to myself than to them. That single word seemed to catch both of them off guard, because it didn't come with anger. It didn't come with panic. It came with acceptance. And acceptance, in this case, didn't mean I agreed. It meant I was done arguing on their terms. "You think I can't provide stability," I continued, my voice steady, almost thoughtful now. "You think I'm not financially secure enough, not emotionally prepared enough, not controlled enough to raise my own child." Neither of them interrupted. They didn't need to. Everything I was saying was already written in that document. "But what I don't understand," I went on, tilting my head slightly as I looked at her, is why you're so confident that a court is going to agree with you. That question shifted something. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. Because this was the first time I had brought the conversation out of the room, out of her control, and into a space where she didn't get to decide the outcome on her own. She exhaled slowly, as if she had been expecting resistance, just not in this direction. We've prepared thoroughly, she said. There are precedents, evaluations, expert opinions. Whose evaluations? I asked. Another pause, smaller this time, but still, there. Because that was the problem with building something this carefully. Every piece had to hold, and all it took was one weak point to unravel the entire structure. I'm sure your lawyer explained all of that to you, she said smoothly, sidestepping the question without actually answering it. I almost smiled, because that wasn't an answer. That was a deflection, which meant there was something there, something she didn't want to say outright. Right, I said softly. Your lawyer. And as soon as I said it, another memory surfaced, clearer now, sharper, no longer something I could dismiss as coincidence. The man at the baby shower. The one who didn't quite fit. Well-dressed, observant, too quiet for someone who was supposedly just a family friend. The way he had been watching, not participating. The way my mother-in-law had introduced him briefly, casually, like it wasn't worth explaining. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Now it felt obvious. He's here, isn't he? I said, glancing toward the hallway, toward the part of the house where a few guests had stepped out earlier. Neither of them confirmed it. But again, they didn't need to. Because a second later, I heard it. A door opening. Footsteps. Measured. Unhurried. And then a man stepped into the room, adjusting the sleeve of his jacket as if he had been waiting for exactly the right moment to appear. Professional. Composed. Prepared. He gave a polite nod, first to my mother-in-law, then briefly to my husband, before his attention settled on me. Mrs. Carter, he said, his tone neutral, practiced. I understand this is a difficult situation. I stared at him for a moment, taking in the calmness, the distance. The way he spoke like this was just another case, another process, another situation to manage. Like my child was paperwork. Like my life was a file. And suddenly, everything became very, very clear. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a scare tactic. It wasn't something meant to pressure me into changing, or apologizing, or proving myself. This was real. This was already in motion. And if I didn't act quickly, it wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was a case. A legal case. With evidence. With representation. With a strategy. I felt my hand press more firmly against my stomach, grounding myself again, reminding myself of what mattered, of what I was actually fighting for. Then I looked back at him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. You're right, I said calmly. It is a difficult situation. A slight pause. Just enough to shift the tone. But not for the reason you think. For the first time since he walked in, his expression changed. Just a little. And that was all I needed. Because if they had spent all this time preparing their case, then now, it was my turn to start building mine. For a moment, no one spoke. Not my husband, not his mother, not even the lawyer who had just stepped into the room like he belonged there. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, shifting, as if something had quietly tilted in a direction none of them had fully anticipated. Because up until now, everything had been moving according to their plan. And now it wasn't. The lawyer was the first to recover, his expression smoothing back into something neutral, professional, carefully detached. My role here, he began, clasping his hands loosely in front of him, is simply to ensure that everyone understands the legal framework of what's been filed. This isn't about taking anything away from you unnecessarily. It's about determining what arrangement would best serve the child's long-term welfare. His tone was calm, almost reassuring, but there was something beneath it that didn't sit right with me. Not aggression, not hostility, something colder. Certainty. Like he had walked into this room already believing he knew how it would end. And you've already determined that? I asked, my voice even, though my attention stayed fixed on him now, not her. He didn't answer directly. That's what the court will decide, he said. Of course. Always the court. Always something distant, abstract, impersonal, something that made it easier to turn a person into a case. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering his words, but in reality, I was watching, listening, not just to what he said, but to what he avoided saying. Because there was a pattern here. Carefully constructed language. Deflection. Control. You keep saying that. I replied, taking a small step closer, not confrontational, but deliberate. But courts don't make decisions out of nowhere. They rely on what's presented to them. A slight pause. And what's been presented, I continued, glancing briefly at the envelope on the table before looking back at him, comes from you. That landed. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to react outwardly, but I saw it. The brief shift in his eyes, the fraction of a second where his composure adjusted. Because now we weren't talking about abstract systems anymore. We were talking about responsibility. My client has provided documentation, he said, more carefully this time. Financial records, lifestyle assessments, professional evaluations. I repeated, letting the words settle before I spoke again. Of me. He hesitated. Just slightly. But it was there. They are based on observed patterns and available information, he said. Observed. Available. Words that sounded harmless until you really looked at them. Observed by who? I asked. Another pause. This one longer. Because now the cracks were starting to show. I'm not at liberty to disclose every detail at this stage, he replied. I almost smiled again. Not because anything about this situation was amusing, but because that answer told me exactly what I needed to know. They didn't have everything locked down as tightly as they wanted me to believe. And more importantly, they didn't expect me to push back like this. I see, I said quietly, nodding once. So you've built a case about my ability to be a mother, without ever actually speaking to me. That's not. My husband started, stepping forward again, but I held up a hand, not even looking at him. Don't, I said, and this time there was no softness in my voice. Because whatever he thought he was going to say, whatever version of this he had convinced himself was acceptable, I wasn't interested in hearing it anymore. Not right now. Not when I was finally starting to understand what I was dealing with. I turned back to the lawyer. You said this is about the child's welfare, I continued. About stability, structure, long-term outcomes. Yes, he said. Then help me understand something. I took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel more direct, more grounded, less like something happening around me, and more like something I was actively shaping. How does removing a child from their mother before they're even born create stability? That question didn't have an easy answer. And for the first time since he had entered the room, the lawyer didn't respond immediately. Because there wasn't a clean, professional way to frame what they were doing that didn't sound exactly like what it was. Intervention. Control. Separation. My client believes, he began. No. I interrupted, sharper this time. I'm asking what you believe. As the person presenting this. As the one who expects a court to accept it. The room felt smaller now. Tighter. Because the conversation had shifted again, away from rehearsed statements, and into something far less comfortable. Personal accountability. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words more carefully than before. In certain circumstances, he said, preemptive guardianship arrangements can prevent instability that might arise from what? I pressed. He held my gaze. From environments that are considered unpredictable. There it was. The label. Clean. Clinical. Completely detached from reality. Unpredictable, I repeated softly. And then, before he could continue, before anyone else could step in and redirect the conversation back into something safer for them, I made a decision. Not impulsive, not emotional, calculated. Then I think we should be very clear about what's actually unpredictable here, I said. I reached for my phone, my movement steady, unhurried, even though I could feel the weight of every eye in the room shift toward me. My husband tensed slightly. His mother's expression didn't change, but I saw it. That flicker of attention, sharper now, more focused. Because this wasn't part of their plan. You've spent all this time collecting information about me. I continued, unlocking the screen, scrolling briefly before stopping on something I had almost forgotten about until now. Asking questions. Watching. Documenting. I looked up. And you're not the only ones who've been paying attention. A beat of silence. Then I turned the phone around and placed it on the table between us. Not dramatically. Not aggressively. Just deliberately. What is this? My husband asked, his voice tighter than before. I didn't answer him. My eyes stayed on her. Go ahead, I said quietly. Take a look. For the first time since this started, my mother-in-law didn't move right away. And that hesitation, That was new. Because whatever she thought she had under control, whatever version of this situation she believed she had already secured, she was starting to realize something she hadn't accounted for. She wasn't the only one who came prepared. For a second, she didn't reach for the phone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the smallest break in her rhythm, the faintest hesitation in someone who, up until now, had moved through this entire situation as if every step had already been decided. Then, slowly, she extended her hand and turned the screen toward herself. The room didn't make a sound. Even my husband stopped moving, his attention locked onto whatever it was I had just placed between us, the same way mine had been locked onto that envelope minutes earlier. Only this time, I wasn't the one on the defensive. She scanned the screen once, her expression controlled, unreadable. Then again, slower, more carefully, and that's when I saw it. Not shock, not panic, something far more telling. Recognition. Her eyes didn't widen, her posture didn't shift, but there was a tightening around her gaze, a slight stillness that hadn't been there before, like a calculation had just changed direction. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice steady, but no longer effortless. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, I hadn't gone looking for this. Not at first. It had started as something small, something easy to dismiss, back when I still believed that whatever tension existed between us was just personality, just difference, just something that could be worked through with time and patience. But over the past few weeks, things hadn't felt right. The questions had become more specific, the concern more pointed, the involvement more intrusive. And somewhere along the way, without fully realizing it, I had started paying closer attention. I didn't think I needed it. I said finally, my voice calm, measured, matching hers now in a way that made the shift between us impossible to ignore. Not until I realized I wasn't the only one being watched. I stepped closer to the table, close enough to see the reflection of the screen in her eyes. "Scroll," I added quietly. She didn't argue, didn't question. She simply moved her finger across the screen. A series of messages, time-stamped, detailed, conversations she had never meant for me to see. Discussions about me, about my pregnancy, about timing, strategy, even language. The kind of language that doesn't belong in family conversations. The kind that belongs in planning, preparation, control. "She's more unstable than she appears. We need documentation before the 3rd trimester. If we wait too long, the court may side with her by default." Each line carefully written, each word deliberate, and none of it meant for me. Behind her, my husband leaned in slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of the screen, but I saw the moment it registered for him too, the exact second when confusion gave way to understanding. And then to something else. Fear. "This isn't," he started, but the words fell apart before they could become anything meaningful. Because there was no version of this he could explain away. No interpretation that made it harmless. "You were planning this before I even lost my job," I said, my voice quieter now, but heavier, grounded in something far more solid than emotion. That was the detail that mattered, the one piece that unraveled the narrative they had tried to build. Because everything in that document, every claim about instability, about timing, about concern, it wasn't reactive. It was premeditated. "I told you," my mother-in-law said, finally looking up from the phone, her expression composed again, but tighter now, more controlled in a way that suggested effort. "This is about ensuring the best outcome." "No," I replied, shaking my head slightly. "This is about you deciding the outcome before there was ever a problem." A brief silence followed that, the kind that doesn't invite interruption, the kind that forces acknowledgement. And for the first time since this began, she didn't try to soften it, didn't try to reframe it, because there was nothing left to hide. "If you had been stable," she said, her tone cooling just slightly, "this wouldn't have been necessary." There it was, the justification, clean, final, as if everything she had done, everything she had planned, could be reduced to a single conditional statement. "If you had been enough, this wouldn't have happened." Something in me reacted to that, not explosively, not the way it might have before, but with a clarity that felt sharper than anger. Because that sentence, that belief, was the foundation of everything she had built. And it was exactly where she was wrong. "You don't get to define that," I said, my voice steady, unwavering now. "Not for me, and definitely not for my child." Behind her, the lawyer shifted slightly, stepping forward again, as if sensing that the direction of this conversation was no longer working in their favor. "We should be careful about how we interpret private communications," he said, his tone more cautious now than it had been earlier. "Context matters. Context," I repeated, turning toward him. Slowly. "You want to talk about context?" I gestured toward the phone. "That context says this wasn't about concern. It was about timing, strategy, control. You didn't build a case because something was wrong." I held his gaze. "You built a case because you wanted to win." That landed harder than anything else I had said so far. Because it didn't just challenge the situation. It challenged him, his role, his justification. And for a moment, just a moment, he didn't respond, which was all I needed. I turned back to her. "You said this is about what's best for the child," I continued. "But what you're really saying is that what's best is whatever you decide." She didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. But the silence between us had changed. Because now, we were no longer standing on the same ground. Before, she had been in control. Before, she had the narrative. Before, she had the advantage of preparation. But now I had something she hadn't planned for. Proof. And more importantly, understanding. Because I finally saw the shape of what she had been building. And once you can see something clearly, it becomes a lot easier to break it. I picked up my phone, locking the screen before slipping it back into my hand, not hiding it, not protecting it, but holding onto it like what it had become. Not just evidence. Leverage. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her voice lower now, less performative, more direct. For the first time, it sounded like a warning. I met her gaze without hesitation. "No," I replied. "It's not." And as the words settled between us, I realized something that shifted everything once again. Up until now, I had been reacting, trying to understand, trying to catch up to something that had already been set in motion without me. But that part was over. Because now, I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing to fight back. Preparing to fight back sounded stronger in my head than it felt in reality. Because the truth was, the moment I stepped out of that room, out of the carefully controlled environment she had created, I was going to be stepping into something much bigger than a family conflict. This wasn't just emotional anymore. It was legal, structured, documented. And whether I liked it or not, they had a head start. The guests were already gone by the time I picked up my bag, their quiet exits leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any confrontation. No one tried to stop me. No one offered comfort. Whatever they had seen, whatever they had understood from what just happened, it had been enough to keep them at a distance. Which, in a strange way, made things clearer. Because now there was no illusion left to maintain. No performance. No pretending this was still a family gathering. As I moved toward the door, I could feel their eyes on me, my husband's, uncertain and conflicted, hers, steady and calculating, and the lawyer's, observant, already assessing what my next move might be. "Running away won't help your case," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational, as if we were discussing something routine. I stopped, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Like he expected me to run. Like that was already part of the story they had written about me. Slowly, I turned back. "I'm not running," I replied, my voice even. "I'm getting a lawyer." That landed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but I saw it, the subtle shift, the recalibration. Because up until now, I had been reacting inside their framework. Now, I was stepping outside of it. "You should have done that sooner," my mother-in-law said, her tone composed again, as if she had already adjusted to this new direction. "It would have made things more efficient." Efficient. The word felt almost absurd in this context, but I didn't react to it. Because reacting was exactly what she understood, what she expected. Instead, I held her gaze for a moment longer, long enough to make one thing clear without having to say it out loud. This wasn't going to be easy anymore. Then I left. The air outside felt different. Cooler. Sharper. Like stepping into reality after being trapped in something artificial for too long. For a few seconds, I just stood there, my hand still resting against my stomach, grounding myself again, reminding myself that no matter how complicated this situation had become, the reason behind it hadn't changed. This wasn't about winning. This was about protecting my child. And that thought, that single, unwavering focus, was enough to push everything else into place. Because once you know what you're fighting for, the fear doesn't disappear, but it stops controlling you. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, And for the first time since this started, I wasn't scrolling through messages or looking for answers. I was making a decision. There was only one person I could think of. Not a close friend. Not family. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years, but who suddenly made perfect sense. Daniel. The name alone felt distant at first, like something from a different version of my life. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Law school. Long nights. Case studies. Arguments that never ended cleanly, but always ended with understanding. He had been the one person I knew who didn't just react to problems. He broke them down, analyzed them, found the weak points. And right now, that was exactly what I needed. I hesitated for just a second before tapping his contact, not because I wasn't sure, but because I knew what this call meant. Once I made it, there was no going back to pretending this could be solved quietly. The line rang twice, then 3 times. And just as I started to wonder if I should have waited, should have thought this through more carefully, hello. His voice was the same, calm, focused, grounded in a way that made everything else feel a little less chaotic. Daniel, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. It's been a while. A brief pause. Recognition. Then, yeah, it has. Is everything okay? I let out a small breath, glancing back toward the house for just a moment before turning away completely. No, I said honestly. It's not. Another pause. Shorter this time. What happened? I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed to say it the right way. Clearly. Completely. Without letting emotion distort the facts. Because this wasn't just a conversation anymore. This was the beginning of my case. My mother-in-law filed for custody of my baby. I said, each word deliberate. Before it's even born. Silence. Not confusion. Not disbelief. Just processing. Okay, he said finally, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more focused, more precise. Start from the beginning. And just like that, everything changed. Because for the first time since this started, I wasn't alone in understanding what I was up against. And more importantly, I finally had someone who knew how to fight it. Start from the beginning. The way Daniel said it didn't feel like a question. It felt like a structure, something solid being placed in front of me after everything else had started to unravel. So I did. Not all at once, not rushed, not emotional the way I might have been an hour ago, but carefully, deliberately, laying everything out piece by piece the way I had just learned to see it. The baby shower, the envelope, the petition, the messages on my phone, the timeline, and most importantly, the pattern. He didn't interrupt much. When he did, it wasn't to react, but to clarify small, precise questions that forced me to be exact about details I might have otherwise glossed over. When did she first start asking about your finances? Who else was present when the document was given to you? Did your husband sign anything you've actually seen? Or is that an assumption? Each question sharpened the story, stripping away anything unnecessary until what remained wasn't just what happened, but what could be proven. By the time I finished, I realized something I hadn't fully noticed while I was speaking. My breathing had steadied. My thoughts had aligned. The chaos had turned into something structured. Okay, Daniel said after a brief pause. And this time, the word carried weight. That helps. Helps? I repeated quietly. It means they moved early, he explained. Which tells me 2 things. I leaned slightly against the car beside me, listening. 1, they're confident. Probably because they think they've built a strong enough narrative around you. That part I already knew. But 2, he continued, they also exposed themselves. That part I hadn't considered. How? I asked. Because timing matters, he said. If they started building this case before any of the issues they're claiming actually happened, like your job situation, then their argument shifts from concern to intent. Intent. The word settled in slowly. They weren't reacting to a problem, I said, thinking it through out loud. They were creating one, he finished. A quiet silence followed, but this one felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating. Clear. Because for the first time, I wasn't just seeing what they had done. I was seeing where it could break. That's not all, Daniel added. The messages you mentioned, do you still have them? Yes. Good. Don't lose them. Don't edit them. Don't send them to anyone else yet. We'll preserve them properly. There was something about the way he said it, calm, controlled, certain, that made me realize just how different this was from everything that had happened earlier. This wasn't reactive. This was strategic. And the lawyer, he continued. Did he identify himself formally? Name, firm, anything. He introduced himself, but I didn't catch everything. That's fine. We can find him. Of course they could. Because unlike me, Daniel didn't need to guess. He knew how this world worked. Listen carefully, he said, his tone shifting slightly, becoming more direct. Right now, you don't confront them again. Not alone. I glanced back at the house instinctively. They're expecting you to react emotionally, he continued. To push back in a way they can document. Don't give them that. That made sense. More than anything else had so far. Because suddenly, all those earlier moments, the questions, the observations, the way everything had been framed, took on a different meaning. They weren't just gathering information. They were waiting for reactions. And my husband? I asked, the question coming out quieter than I expected. A brief pause. That depends, Daniel said carefully. Right now, he's not on your side. But that doesn't mean he's permanently against you. I closed my eyes for a second, letting that settle. Because that was the hardest part to accept. Not what his mother had done, but what he had allowed. What do I do? I asked. For now, Daniel replied. You document everything. Every conversation. Every message. Every interaction. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. Second, you don't sign anything. Not a single piece of paper without representation. I already told her that. Good. Keep it that way. There was a brief pause, and then his voice shifted again, slightly softer this time, but no less firm. And third, I waited. You come see me. That was it. Simple. Direct. Final. Because up until now, everything had been happening around me, decisions being made without me, plans unfolding that I was only just beginning to understand. But this was the first real step forward. When? I asked. As soon as possible, he said. Today, if you can. I glanced down at myself, at the dress I was still wearing from the baby shower, at the remnants of a day that had started as something completely different. Then I looked back at the house one last time, at everything I was about to leave behind, at least for now. I'll be there, I said. Good, Daniel replied. And one more thing. Yeah. Don't underestimate them, he said. But don't overestimate them either. A small pause. They made a move. His tone sharpened, just slightly. Now it's your turn. The call ended, but the words stayed with me. Because for the first time since this started, this didn't feel like something happening to me anymore. It felt like something I could step into, shape, challenge, and maybe win. I took a deep breath, opened the car door, and slid into the driver's seat, my hands resting on the wheel for just a second before starting the engine. The road ahead wasn't clear. Not yet. But at least now, I knew where I was going. By the time I reached Daniel's office, the world outside had already started to move on from what, for me, still felt like the center of everything. Cars passed. People walked. Conversations continued in quiet corners of sidewalks and cafes, as if nothing had happened. And in a way, nothing had. Not yet. Because everything that mattered now hadn't played out in public. It was waiting. Inside rooms like this one. Daniel's office wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. It felt structured, intentional, every detail placed for a reason. Clean lines, muted colors, shelves lined with case files and legal texts that weren't there for decoration. This was a place where things were built carefully, strategically, and as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it, the shift from reaction to preparation. He was already waiting, standing near his desk, sleeves slightly rolled, posture relaxed but focused in a way that made it clear he had already been thinking several steps ahead. For a brief second, something familiar surfaced, recognition, memory, a reminder of a time when life had been simpler, when conversations like this had been theoretical, something studied, not lived. But that moment passed quickly, because this was real. You made good time, he said, gesturing for me to sit. I did, setting my bag down beside me, my phone still in my hand, as if I hadn't fully let go of the evidence it carried. For a second, neither of us spoke, not out of hesitation, but because he was observing, taking in details the same way he probably did with every case. How are you holding up? He asked finally. It wasn't casual. It wasn't polite. It was measured, relevant, because how I answered that question would tell him more than just how I felt. I'm clear, I said after a moment. Not okay, not fine, clear. And something in his expression shifted slightly, like that was the answer he needed. Good, he said. Clarity helps. He moved to his desk, picked up a notepad, and sat across from me. The space between us no longer emotional, but functional. Let's go through this again, he said. But this time, we're not telling a story. A small pause. We're building a case. The difference between those two things settled in immediately. Because earlier, when I told him everything over the phone, I was explaining what happened. Now, we were deciding what mattered. I took a breath and started again, but this time, the details came out differently. Tighter, more focused, less about how it felt, more about what could be used. The exact wording on the document, the timeline of events, the messages, the presence of the lawyer at the baby shower. Every piece laid out, examined, refined. Daniel didn't rush me, but he didn't let anything drift either. If something was vague, he stopped me. If something was assumed, he corrected it. If something was important, he circled back to it until it was precise. By the time we reached the end, the situation no longer felt chaotic. It felt structured. And then he leaned back slightly, studying his notes. Okay, he said. That word again. But now it carried something different. Assessment. They have 3 angles, he continued. Financial stability, emotional fitness, and environmental control. Hearing it laid out like that made everything click into place in a way that was almost unsettling. Because that was exactly what they had been building. Your job loss supports the first, he went on. Their documentation, whatever it actually contains, will try to support the second. And the third, he paused briefly, comes down to narrative. Narrative, I repeated. How they present your life, he explained. Not just facts. Interpretation. Of course, because facts alone weren't enough. It was how those facts were framed. And the messages? I asked. They're important, he said. Very important. He tapped his pen lightly against the notepad, thinking. They show intent. Pre-planning. That this wasn't a response to risk, but an attempt to create a legal position before one existed. That word again. Intent. The same crack in their foundation he had pointed out earlier. But, he added, looking at me directly now, they're not enough on their own. That part, I had expected, because nothing about this was going to be simple. What do we need? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, walked over to a shelf, and pulled out a thin folder, placing it on the desk between us. Leverage, he said. I looked at the folder, then back at him. In what sense? In the sense that right now, he said, they believe they're in control. They believe they've defined the narrative, set the timeline, and forced you into a defensive position. He opened the folder, revealing a few blank documents, templates, outlines, nothing filled in yet, but all clearly part of a process. What we're going to do, he continued, is take that control away from them. Something in my chest tightened slightly, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because this was the first time someone had said it that clearly. Not just defend. Take control. How? I asked. He met my gaze, steady, focused, by showing the court something they didn't plan for. A small pause. A stronger version of you. That wasn't what I expected. Not evidence. Not documents. Me. They're building a case that you're unstable, he explained. So we counter that with consistency. Documentation of your routine. Medical records. Financial plans. Support systems. Each word added another layer. Another piece. And your husband? I asked, because no matter how much I tried to separate him from this, he was still part of it. For now, Daniel said, he's a variable. Not ally. Not enemy. A variable. And variables, he added, can change. I let that sit for a moment, not because I fully believed it yet, but because I understood what it meant. Nothing was fixed. Not yet. And them? I asked quietly. What do they do next? Daniel closed the folder, his expression sharpening just slightly. If they're as prepared as you say, he replied, they won't stop here. A beat of silence. They'll escalate. The word landed differently than everything else. Because escalation meant movement, action, pressure, and that meant whatever came next wouldn't be subtle. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, feeling the weight of it settle in a way that felt less overwhelming than before. Because now, I wasn't guessing anymore. I was preparing. So we moved first, I said. It wasn't a question. It was a decision. And for the first time since I walked into that baby shower, Daniel allowed himself a small, almost approving nod. Exactly. The room fell quiet again, but this time, it wasn't heavy. It was focused, like the calm before something begins. And as I sat there, looking at the empty pages in front of me, I realized something that would have terrified me just hours ago. This wasn't just about stopping them anymore. This was about proving them wrong. On record, in a way they couldn't control. And once that process started, there would be no easy way back for anyone involved. Escalation didn't come the next day. It came that night. I had barely made it back home before the first message arrived. Not from my husband, not from his mother, but from an unknown number that didn't bother introducing itself. You've been formally served. No explanation. No courtesy. Just a notification, followed seconds later by an email that felt far more official than anything I had opened before. I didn't rush to read it. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I already knew what it would say. They weren't waiting. They were accelerating. I forwarded everything to Daniel before even opening the attachment, a habit forming faster than I expected, and only after I saw his reply. Asterisk, asterisk, got it. Call me. Did I finally tap the screen and begin to read? The language was sharper this time. Less cautious. More direct. A formal motion requesting temporary emergency consideration. That phrase alone made my chest tighten, not out of panic, but because I understood exactly what it was designed to do. Reframe urgency. Create pressure. Push the timeline forward before I could fully respond. But what mattered more wasn't the request itself. It was what came with it. Attachments. Statements. And one name I didn't expect to see. My husband. For a second, I thought I had misread it. That maybe I was projecting, filling in gaps that weren't actually there. So I went back. Read it again. Slower. Carefully. There was no mistake. A signed declaration. His declaration. Supporting concerns about emotional instability, financial inconsistency, and unpredictable behavior under stress. Each phrase cleaner than anything he had ever said to me in real life. Each sentence structured in a way that didn't sound like him. Because it wasn't. It had been written for him. But he had signed it. And that was enough. I didn't realize I had stopped breathing until my phone rang. Daniel. I answered immediately. You saw it, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. I replied, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. A brief pause on the other end, like he was adjusting something in his mind, recalculating. Okay, he said. That's the escalation. I leaned back against the wall, letting the weight of that settle, not resisting it this time, not trying to soften it into something less than what it was. They're pushing for emergency standing, he continued. That's aggressive. It means they want to create the impression that waiting puts the child at risk. But there is no risk, I said. I know that, he replied. You know that. But the court doesn't know anything yet. It only sees what's presented. Of course. Back to narrative. Always narrative. And now they have him, I said quietly. Another pause. This one longer. Because this wasn't just legal anymore. This was personal. Yes, Daniel said finally. They do. There was no attempt to soften it. No reassurance. Just clarity. And somehow, that helped more. Good, I said. The word came out before I could second-guess it. Before I could filter it into something more expected. And for the first time since the call started. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Good, he repeated. Yes, I said, pushing away from the wall, forcing myself to stand straight, to feel the ground under my feet again. Because now it's clear. How? Because before, I said, choosing my words carefully, there was still a version of this where he didn't fully understand what she was doing. Where he thought he was helping. Where he believed her. A small pause. That version doesn't exist anymore. Silence. Not disagreement. Consideration. You're sure? Daniel asked. I looked down at the screen again, at the signature, at the clean, deliberate lines of a statement that had turned everything from doubt into certainty. Yes, I said. I'm sure. Because whatever influence she had, whatever control she had built over him over the years, this was a choice. And choices have consequences. All right, Daniel said, his tone shifting again, sharper now, more focused. Then we adjust. That word again. Adjust. Not react. Not panic. Adjust. They want emergency consideration, he continued. We give them context. What does that mean? I asked. It means we respond fast, he said. And we respond strong. We challenge the urgency, we challenge the claims, and most importantly, he paused, just long enough to make sure I was listening. We challenge his credibility. That landed differently than everything else. Because until now, even with everything that had happened, there had still been a line I hadn't fully crossed. A hesitation. A part of me that didn't want to turn this into something irreversible. But that line was already gone. You can do that? I asked. Yes, he said simply. If there's something to challenge. I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I did. And saying it out loud would make it real in a way nothing else had yet. There is, I said finally. A quiet shift on the other end. Then we use it, Daniel replied. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the last piece fall into place, not resisting it anymore, not trying to hold on to what things used to be. Because that version of this, that version of us, was already gone. What do you need from me? I asked. Everything, he said. Every message between you two. Every financial record. Any proof of support, consistency, stability. And a brief pause. Anything that shows he's not as reliable as they're presenting him. There it was. The counter. Not just defending myself, but shifting the spotlight. I nodded slowly, even though he couldn't see it. I'll get it, I said. I know you will, he replied. And one more thing. Yeah. From this point on, he said, his voice steady, unwavering. You stop thinking like someone being accused. A small pause. You start thinking like someone building a case. The call ended, but the words stayed with me. Because this was it. The moment where everything changed again. Not because of what they did, but because of what I was about to do next. I looked down at my phone one last time, at the document, at the name that used to mean something different to me. Then I locked the screen, set it aside, and for the first time since I walked into that baby shower, I didn't feel like I was catching up anymore. I felt like I was ready. Because if they wanted to escalate, then so would I. The hearing was set faster than I expected. Not weeks, days. Which, according to Daniel, was exactly the point. They're trying to keep you on the back foot, he told me as we walked into the courthouse that morning, his pace steady, his voice low enough to stay between us. Short timeline, limited preparation, controlled narrative. It works if the other side isn't ready. I glanced at him briefly. And if they are? He didn't look at me when he answered. Then it backfires. The building itself felt colder than I imagined, not physically, but structurally, like everything inside it had been stripped down to function alone. No room for emotion, no space for interpretation that couldn't be justified. Which meant one thing. This wasn't about how I felt. This was about what I could prove. We stepped into the courtroom together, and for a brief moment, everything slowed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but enough for me to take it in. The judge, the seating, the space where decisions would be made. And then, them. My mother-in-law sat composed, as always, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable in that familiar, controlled way that used to make me second-guess everything I thought I understood about her. Beside her, the lawyer, prepared, organized, already moving through papers with the kind of quiet efficiency that suggested this was just another case to him. And then, my husband. He didn't look at me right away. But when he did, it wasn't avoidance this time. It was something else. Tension. Expectation. Like he was waiting to see who I would be when this started. I didn't hold his gaze for long. Because whatever version of me he thought he knew was no longer relevant. Remember, Daniel said quietly as we took our seats, this isn't about reacting to them. A small pause. It's about letting them reveal themselves. That settled something in me. Because up until now, every step they had taken had been about control, framing the situation, defining the narrative, moving before I had time to respond. But today, they had to present it. Out loud. On record. And that meant every weakness, every assumption, every overreach, had a chance to be seen. The hearing began without ceremony. No dramatic introduction. No build-up. Just process. Their lawyer spoke first. He outlined their concerns with calm precision, moving through the same points I had already seen in the documents, but now framed in a way that was meant to sound objective, reasonable, necessary. Financial instability. Emotional unpredictability. Lack of consistent support structure. Each phrase delivered cleanly, without accusation, without emotion, because that made it sound more credible, more believable, more dangerous. And then, he introduced the declaration. My husband's declaration. I didn't look at him this time. I didn't need to, because I already knew what it said. What mattered now was how it would be used. Based on these factors, the lawyer concluded, we are requesting temporary emergency consideration to ensure the child's welfare is protected from potential risk. Potential risk. The phrase echoed in my mind, not because it was convincing, but because it was strategic. It didn't need to prove anything. It just needed to suggest enough. And for a brief moment, the room was still, waiting, observing. Then Daniel stood, not rushed, not reactive, measured. "Your Honor," he began, his tone steady, controlled in a way that immediately shifted the energy in the room. "What opposing counsel has presented is not a response to risk." A small pause. "It's an attempt to manufacture one." That landed, not loudly, but clearly. And for the first time since the hearing started, the narrative shifted. "They are asking for emergency consideration," he continued, "based on claims of instability that, upon examination, do not align with the actual timeline of events." He turned slightly, just enough to reference the documents without breaking his rhythm. The petition was prepared prior to the alleged triggering circumstances. The documentation began before any financial disruption occurred. The narrative was constructed in advance. Each sentence built on the last. Not emotional, not aggressive, just precise. "This is not concern," he said. "This is premeditation." Silence. Not empty. Focused. Because now, the court wasn't just hearing a claim. It was hearing a contradiction. "And we have evidence to support that," Daniel added. That was the moment everything tightened. Across the room, I saw it. The slight shift in my mother-in-law's posture, the near imperceptible glance between her and the lawyer, the recalculation happening in real time. Because this wasn't part of their plan. Daniel placed the printed messages forward, organized, time-stamped, structured in a way that made them impossible to dismiss as isolated or taken out of context. "Communications," he said, demonstrating intent to build a legal position prior to any legitimate concern. The judge reviewed them briefly. Not long, just enough. And in that short span of time, the weight of the room changed. "What is the explanation for this?" the judge asked. Not directed at me, not at Daniel, at them. Their lawyer stepped forward again, composed but tighter now, his earlier certainty replaced with something more careful. "These messages lack full context," he said. "They reflect concern, not strategy." "Concern," Daniel repeated, not interrupting, but aligning himself within the conversation in a way that shifted its direction. "Then perhaps," he continued, "we should examine the consistency of that concern." And that was the moment. The pivot. Because what came next wasn't about me anymore. It was about him. "Your Honor," Daniel said, turning slightly. "The declaration submitted by the father presents a picture of stability and objectivity that we believe deserves closer examination." My husband finally looked at me. Not with confidence, not with certainty, but with something else. Something that told me, for the first time since this began, he didn't know what was coming next. And neither did they. "We have documentation," Daniel continued, "that calls into question the reliability of that declaration." The words hung in the air. Heavy, deliberate, irreversible. Because once that line was crossed, there was no going back to what this used to be. And as I sat there, watching everything unfold, I realized something that would have terrified me before. This wasn't just about defending myself anymore. This was about dismantling everything they had built, piece by piece, on record, in a way they couldn't control. And for the first time since the hearing began, I saw it. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. The shift, because the outcome, was no longer as certain as they thought. The room didn't erupt. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden shift in volume or visible shock. But everything changed. Not in a way you could point to immediately, not in something obvious or loud, but in the subtle, irreversible way attention moved. The focus wasn't on me anymore, not on what I lacked or what I was being accused of. It was on them, on what they had built, and whether it could hold. Daniel didn't rush. He never did. He let that moment sit just long enough for the weight of his last statement to settle before continuing. His tone as measured as it had been from the start, but now carrying something more decisive. "The declaration presented to this court," he said, "relies heavily on the credibility of the father as a consistent, objective source of concern." A small pause. "However, that credibility is not as stable as it has been portrayed." Across the room, I saw my husband straighten slightly, his jaw tightening, his attention locking fully onto Daniel now. Because this was no longer abstract. This was about him. "We have records," Daniel continued, "of repeated financial dependence that contradicts the narrative of stability. We have communication indicating external influence on the framing of his concerns. And most importantly, he paused, just long enough. We have evidence that his statements were not independently formed. That was the line, the one that cut through everything else. Because it didn't just challenge what he said. It challenged whether those words were ever truly his. Their lawyer moved quickly this time, stepping forward with more urgency than before. Your Honor, these are serious implications, he said. If there is evidence, it should be formally submitted and reviewed, and it will be, Daniel replied, calm, unshaken, in full. Then he stepped back slightly, not retreating, just done, because he didn't need to push further. Not yet. The damage had already been done. The judge looked down at the documents again, then back up, her expression unreadable but sharper now, more focused in a way that made it clear the direction of this hearing had shifted. Given the nature of these claims, she said, the request for emergency consideration will be evaluated with caution. A small pause. Very carefully. That was it. No final decision. No immediate resolution. But it was enough. Because emergency orders rely on urgency, on confidence, on the absence of doubt. And now, there was doubt, which meant time. And time was something they hadn't planned to give me. Beside me, I felt it before I saw it. My husband shifting again, his composure no longer as controlled as it had been when we first walked in. This time, when I looked at him, he didn't look away. There was something different in his expression now. Not confidence, not certainty, something closer to realization. Like he was finally seeing the full shape of what he had stepped into, and what it was costing him. For a brief second, something inside me reacted to that. Not forgiveness, not even sympathy, but recognition of what used to be there, of what used to matter. But it didn't stay, because whatever we had already been changed by choices that couldn't be undone with a look. The hearing moved forward briefly after that, procedural, structured, focused on next steps rather than conclusions. Deadlines, submissions, follow-ups, all the pieces of a process that was no longer one-sided. And then, it ended, just like that. No announcement, no closure, just the quiet understanding that this wasn't over. Not even close. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different again, not lighter, not easier, but clearer in a way that made everything ahead feel more defined. Daniel walked beside me in silence for a moment before finally speaking. That went well, he said. Well, the word felt strange in this context, but I understood what he meant. They didn't get what they wanted, I replied. No, he said. And more importantly, he glanced at me briefly. They're no longer controlling the pace. That mattered, more than anything else, because up until now, every move had been theirs. Now, that had changed. Behind us, I heard the sound of footsteps. I didn't need to turn to know who it was, but I did anyway. My husband. He stopped a few feet away, not too close, not too far, like he didn't quite know where he was allowed to stand anymore. I didn't think it would go like this, he said. His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't controlled. It was uncertain. And for the first time since this began, it sounded real. I looked at him for a moment, taking in the shift, the cracks in the version of himself he had been holding on to. And how did you think it would go? I asked. He hesitated, then looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. I thought it would help, he said. The honesty of it didn't fix anything. It didn't change what he had done, but it explained just enough to make it worse. Help who? I asked quietly. He didn't answer, because he didn't have one. And maybe that was the most honest thing he could have given me. A silence stretched between us, not hostile, not explosive, just final in a way that didn't need to be stated out loud. Then I nodded once. Not in agreement. Not in forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. And turned away. Because whatever conversation we might have one day, this wasn't it. This was something else. Something that had already moved beyond us. As I walked away, Daniel fell back in a step beside me. And for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like I was being pulled in every direction at once. I felt aligned. Not because things were over, but because I finally understood where I stood. And more importantly, where I was going. Because this was never really about proving them wrong. It was about refusing to let someone else decide who I was allowed to be. As a mother, as a person, as someone who had been underestimated, and wouldn't be again. And whatever came next, I was ready for it.